Now, at first glance, this looks humorous, but how would you feel if I told you that millions of women around the world were doing this every day? You'd be outraged at the thought, wouldn't you? Okay, so they aren't literally pouring alcohol into their babies' bottles, but what they are doing is even worse. They're drinking during pregnancy. And drinking during pregnancy causes a wide range of problems for the baby, from mild to severe. And as a mother of 5 children, I can't help but have an emotional reaction whenever I hear about illnesses or diseases that harm children. But then, of course, I get excited when I hear about possible treatments that might take care of those problems. And I first heard about possible treatments for prenatal alcohol exposure from my mentor, Dr. Jennifer Thomas, when I was taking one of her classes. And that brings us to our current research project, which asks the question, will exercise alleviate some fetal alcohol effects? So, as I said, prenatal alcohol exposure causes a wide range of developmental disorders. On the severe end of the continuum, the child is diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome, which has such characteristics as both pre- and postnatal growth deficits, and facial dysmorphology, meaning that the facial features don't form correctly. For example, they'll have a flattened midface, like a short nose, an indistinct philtrum, and a thin upper lip, as well as other distinguishing facial characteristics. But this also causes damage to the central nervous system, or CNS, and this will cause such behavioral differences as hyperactivity, attention deficits, motor dysfunction, language impairments, learning and social skills deficits, as well as others. But not all children have damage severe enough to be diagnosed with full-fledged fetal alcohol syndrome, but they still have severe brain damage. And so this range of outcomes is referred to as fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Now, ideally, we wouldn't have to come up with a treatment for FASD. If women didn't drink during pregnancy, it wouldn't exist, plain and simple. But realistically, many women do continue to drink during pregnancy, so coming up with an effective treatment is critical. But unfortunately, surprisingly little research has been done on effective treatment strategies so far. So various animal studies have suggested pharmacological interventions that reduce the severity of some of these fetal alcohol effects, but concerns over their safety may prevent clinical use. So obviously, coming up with an effective treatment that would reduce the severity of these fetal alcohol effects without having serious side effects is of utmost importance. So prenatal alcohol exposure damages the hippocampus, which is an area of the brain important for learning and memory. And it also reduces the vasculature, or the amount of blood veins in the central nervous system. And various animal studies have shown that rearing in an enriched environment or even acrobatic motor training can reduce the severity of some fetal alcohol effects. So this would suggest that modifications of behavior or environmental conditions could reduce the severity of fetal alcohol effects. Meanwhile, other animal studies have shown that physical exercise, such as access to a running wheel, enhances learning ability. It increased neurogenesis, or the growth of new neurons, in the brain, and it also increased, or in the hippocampus, and it increased vasculature in the brain. And these pictures here are from one of those studies. They're slides taken from the adult mouse brain. And that's what's interesting, is these aren't juvenile brains that are still growing. These are adult mouse brains. And this is a control mouse, but in the lower one, those little red and yellow spots are actually new neurons growing. So then, if access to physical exercise via a running wheel may serve as an effective treatment for some fetal alcohol effects. If effective, this would provide a safe, easy-to-implement treatment strategy for FASD. The results have important implications for children born to drinking mothers. So all of this now brings us to our research question, which asked, will access to a running wheel stimulate neuronal growth and improve learning ability in rats exposed to alcohol during development? So what we do is expose rats to alcohol shortly after birth. And we choose this time period because rats aren't fully developed at birth. Developmentally, they're at the equivalent of a human fetus during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. And then after weaning, we'll expose half of the rats to running wheels for a month. And then at the end of that time, we'll do behavioral testing on all of the rats. So then, if running increases plasticity in the brain and leads to improvements in cognitive performance, it would suggest that exercise programs could serve as effective treatments for improving cognitive performance in children exposed to alcohol prenatally. So we'll have a total of 6 treatment groups, 2 ethanol groups, one with running wheel, one without, 2 intubated control groups, one with wheel, one without, and then 2 non-intubated control groups. And the treatments would take place on postnatal days 4 through 9, and starting with the ethanol group, in the morning they would receive 2 intubations, oral intubations, of rat baby formula that has been dosed with a predetermined dosage of alcohol. And then after those 2 morning feedings, they're too drunk to nurse naturally, so we give them 2 afternoon feedings of just plain milk formula. The intubated control group receives sham intubations, and what that means is we go through the motions of intubating them, but they don't receive any formula or any water or anything like that. And this is just to control for the effects of the intubation. And I've spoken with people who've had oral intubations, and it isn't painful, but let's face it, it's unnerving. And we can't explain to the rats what we're doing or why we're doing it because they don't understand English, and even if they did, at this age they're blind, so it wouldn't do any good. So just to control for any effects of the intubation, we have this control group here. And then the non-intubated control groups receive no treatments whatsoever. And I will say that our study is still underway. We've collected about 40% of the data, so it isn't complete yet, and I'll be speaking in the present tense because we're still performing the study. So now when you read the literature about the intubations, and it says we use PE tubing and do da-da-da-da-da, you can't picture what we're doing. So since this is my favorite part of the study, I decided to take some photos here. This is a 4-day-old rat. The 4-day-old rat is about the size of my thumb. And then you have to take this tiny little tubing, which is smaller than angel hair pasta and only slightly firmer than cooked spaghetti, and you have to put it down their esophagus. Yeah, right. So you put it in their mouth, and then you twiddle it, which tickles the back of their throat, which stimulates them to swallow so that you can get it down their esophagus, because you don't want it to go down the trachea into their lungs, because that's not good. So you put it down into their stomach, and you heat it up the formula so it's nice and warm. And what's really neat here is on the 4-day-old one, you can actually watch the stomach fill, which I think is really cool. No, it's still going through getting. But the reason this is my favorite part of the study is you do get to sit down 4 times a day, spend time with the animals, and they start off totally naked like little birds. And by the 9th day, they're covered in fur, and they're up toddling on their little legs, and they're starting to wash their little faces, and they're just so cute. And you know how a dog, if you scratch just the right spot on their stomach, how the little back leg starts going? With them, if the milk hits just the right spot in their tummy, it tickles, and the little back legs start going. So the rats grow on them, believe it or not. So after 3 weeks, the rats are weaned, and they're housed in pairs, half in regular cages, half in cages with the running wheels. And we discovered that at 3 weeks they're so young they can't get the larger wheels to spin. So we had to start them off on these smaller wheels, and then when they get big enough, then we move them into these cages that have the larger running wheels. So after a month of this, the rats that are in running wheels are taken out of those and housed back in regular cages when the behavioral testing begins. And that's an important point, so keep that in mind. At 52 days of age, the behavioral testing begins with the Morris water maze. And they'll do this test for 8 days. Fetal alcohol exposure causes damage to their spatial learning ability, and the Morris water maze has proven to be a highly effective test of spatial learning ability. So what we do is we make the water opaque, and then a platform will be submerged in one quadrant of the pool, and it will stay in that location for that individual rat for the testing. We put the rat in the water, they've got 4 trials per day, and then they swim around, and the video camera will videotape them as they swim around trying to find the platform. But the trick is, because it's painted white inside, there's no cues to help them memorize where the platform is. They're going to have to use visual cues that are more distant, up on the walls. But the catch is that each time we put them in the water, we put them in from a different location. So sometimes they have to swim to the right to find the platform, sometimes to the left to find the platform, sometimes they'll be directly opposite where they enter the water. So that's what makes this a test of their spatial learning abilities. So then after 8 days of the Morris water maze, we move on to the activity chamber. As I had said, prenatal alcohol exposure causes hyperactivity, so we want to test the activity levels of all of the animals. So they'll be tested here for 4 days. What we do is at night during their active cycle, because they're nocturnal, we'll put them in here for an hour. This is a plexiglass box surrounded by these bars that have infrared beams going around. So as the rat moves around, they will break those beams, which measures their movements, and the computer will track all of this. We even have 2 levels, so we can even measure when they rear up onto their hind legs. So after 4 days of testing in the activity chamber, the behavioral testing is done. So what have we learned so far? In all of the graphs here, blue will represent the animals that didn't have access to running wheels. Purple is the animals that did have access to running wheels. Far left is ethanol, center intubated controls, right is the non-intubated controls. Path length measured in meters. Path length is the distance covered as they swam around looking for that submerged platform. Latency is the amount of time it took for them to find the platform. Not their speed, but the amount of time the individual took finding the platform. And what you can see here in both of these graphs is that the animals exposed to ethanol clearly had deficits in their spatial learning abilities caused by the alcohol damage. And yet the ones that had access to the running wheels, that damage was alleviated. This was a statistically significant change. Now the non-intubated controls, this appears reversed, but what it was, as I said, we only had 40% of the data. At the beginning of the study, we were very eager to see was there going to be an ethanol effect or a running wheel effect. So the majority of our animals were in these two groups. We had very few animals in the non-intubated control group. So we're confident that as we collect more data on the other animals and we have more in that group, that will change. So resultant activity was rather interesting. Here's the total distance covered as they moved around in the activity chamber in inches. And we're finding that there was hyperactivity in both the intubated control and the ethanol. So it could be that this hyperactivity was caused by that early handling experience. But what's still interesting is that the activity levels were reduced by having access to the running wheels. Now remember I said that they hadn't had the running wheels for 8 to 12 days. So their levels weren't reduced because they're tired from being up partying the night before. They hadn't exercised for a week and a half, and yet their activity levels were reduced. Now over here, center entries. Rats are cautious by nature, and so they tend to be wall huggers, which is a behavior called phimotaxis. So you would expect a normal rat to spend most of their time around the periphery of the activity chamber. And so this is measuring here their movement into the center of the activity chamber. Now the non-intubated controls, as you would expect, spent very little time moving out into the center. But here the intubated controls and the ethanols, clearly a behavioral change. They were spending more time going out into the middle of the box. But again, having access to the running wheel reduced that behavior. So, as you've probably gathered by now, ethanol exposure during the third trimester equivalent produces hyperactivity and spatial learning deficits. But what was interesting to see is that exercise did reduce the severity of those problems. And what's exciting is that the benefits of that exercise were still clearly evident even 12 days after the exercise ended. So while these tests are tests of behavior, which is an external measurement, still it could be that exercise may increase the neuronal plasticity even following alcohol-induced brain damage. So this data so far does suggest that there could be benefits to instituting exercise programs to children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. So a great big thank you to my mentor, Dr. Jennifer Thomas, and to Dr. Daniel DeLugas, who works at the lab, and to Tammy and Jeremy and the rest of the grad students at the lab. And Wilbur wants to know, do you have any questions?
Looks like Bill.
You mentioned how exercise is effective, but have you recorded how much exercise is necessary and if there's a minimum or
Well, this is the first time that a study of this major specific type has been done. So this is all basically a pilot study. And so here we did 30 days. So as to, and we saw results. So as to a minimum or maximum, we don't really know yet. Right? This is the first time we've done this study.
So there was like no recording of the time period when rat ran a mouse ran on the wheel or anything.
Well, so we couldn't take them off and test their activity levels periodically in between, because what happens is, like, say after a week we took them and put them in the activity chamber, then after another week if you go and put them in again, they're now familiar with it, which with habituation. It's like, oh, I've been here before. So their behavior levels would be different. So we couldn't do that.
This might be a simple question,
But I like simple questions. Those are
when
good.
the rats, the ones that you tested gave the exercise were, their stage was at the same stage of mother in her third trimester. So the exercise would be done by the mother. That's what you're saying. If it made a difference, the mother would be doing the exercise because the baby.
No, these was all done on the babies after they were born.
I mean, you're doing it on them to show that the exercise affects the alcohol level. So how would that relate to the humans? That's what I'm saying. What would it?
Yeah, the humans, the children, after they're born, instituting programs for the children.
But you're actually testing the rats when it would be the
The
level
damage is done during the equivalent of the third trimester, but then the rats, the activity is started after weaning, so that would still be the equivalent of a small child. In fact, 21 days of age, a rat is sexually mature at about 28 to 30 days of age, isn't it? That we have to.
We're doing a little, I was just wondering here in terms of your design, early curiosity, sort of whether it was worth going at. I guess it's sort of like, is it really worth pursuing? But you think that this might have an effect on some of your randomization, some of the randomization running your rats, sort of.
Well, we do always try to prevent a litter effect. Like there's no way we would take an entire litter and have it be non-intubated controls, because then it could be the effect of them being siblings, same sire and dam. So we always do try to make sure that there's like one ethanol running wheel and one ethanol no running wheel, try to randomize it. So even now that we are winding down to the end of the study, we do still have to control for that effect and still randomize and lost litters to prevent it.
Any other questions?
So relating this to humans one more time, you would take a baby and an infant, like when was a child, because I can't think of much exercise that infants can do once they're born. So what type of, because they're using a running wheel, and at what age will the child be able to use some sort of physical activity such as the running wheel or something of that sort too?
I mean, we can't just take them and strap them to a treadmill? No, well, that's just the key there, is getting those kids out there and getting them into other. That's the tragedy, like we were talking about in one of the morning sessions, is how they're cutting PE programs out of schools and things like that. So that would be one of the key questions, is how early to implement and what type of effective exercise programs you can do with children.
Can you rule out the effect that the exercise is giving more oxygen to the brain and not necessarily
Well, one of the ways that the exercise gets more oxygen to the brain is we have to have the vasculature, the blood veins, and that's how the oxygen gets to the brain, is the increase in vasculature.
and not necessarily being neurologic repair, mitigating the damages of the alcohol center.
Good question.
Next experiment, huh? Put them in a hyperbaric chamber.
Yeah.
And manipulate their variable. I think, well, actually, I was going to mention that one of the things you should maybe mention is the age. When you're talking about from post-natal 21 to 51 in the rat really would be equivalent more to middle childhood up to a much older age. But that's an interesting question in terms of what the mechanism is of that neuroplasticity associated with the running. At this point, nobody really does know. But there is that evidence, at least with the mice, that there's increased neurogenesis. Whether it's related to increased oxygen. I mean, probably both are occurring at the same time. So.
Looks like you had fun doing that.
Oh, yes. I'm such an animal lover